Okay, we're finally moving on to Book 8 of the Republic. So, Book 8, we're specifically looking at what type of government is best. And so, like, this is notably before any of, like, this is one of the first attempts to solve how the political arena should be run from a philosophic perspective, or at least from Socrates' political perspective, which notably is kind of an odd thing to consider because Socrates is inherently saying that the private life is better than the public life, which is why the philosopher king doesn't want to actually lead and will want to stay in the private life as much as possible. But that when called and when asked to lead by the people, then the philosopher king should actually take up the charge of being the ruler of the city. Um, but so in here he's going to be considering which forms of government are best. Notably, like this is the first kick of the can. This is not. I wouldn't consider this an authoritative book on how we should actually run government, of course. Um, but he's going to go through things like why a democracy doesn't work in his opinion, um, and also things like a democracy, which is simply requiring rulers to own property and also a love of honor and ambition. Uh, and there's, yeah, I guess it's kind of an odd take, but I think it also interesting can relate to like the current federal election as well. And like when we're imagining what kind of a future we want for Canada, how does this play into the current paradigm shift between what was Trudeau versus Polyev to now Mark Carney versus Polyev? And what do they both offer as a viable vision for the future? It's kind of hard to see now before the campaign is really fleshed out, but we can kind of start to see the outlines of what their campaigns will include. Mark Carney is very much seems to be in the camp of wanting UBI and more socialist protections so that while also promoting big business dealings as well. I'm not really sure how this is going to lead to a middle class recovery in which he is talking about, but certainly it will be interesting to see how he plans to flesh things out. He's much more of a technocratic bureaucrat, which is what we tend to lean towards when in lieu of strong leadership. I think in Canada because we are very much a technocratic society and we very much like being having our country run by smart people. We often defer decisions to judges because they're often impartial and will give us the right answer and from a human rights perspective or from a legal perspective, and really help politicians navigate those difficult questions. Notably, like medical assistance and suicide was a Supreme Court decision, and it was one where it was, I believe, it was asked by Parliament or by the Prime Minister to the Supreme Court to spell it out clearly because they couldn't figure out how to write the legislation themselves. They tried writing it and then it got shot down by the Supreme Court. And they're like, well, can you just give us the formula for how to do this properly? And so they made them go back in a different case, I believe, and actually give a formula for how we can administer medically assisted suicide. Um, medicine, yeah. Anyways, so we read that Supreme Court case in my bioethics class, which was really interesting to not only like read through a Supreme Court case because I hadn't really done that before, but also to like really see the logic that they use in a step by step way, and it was really just laid out simply, but there's obviously like these underlying assumptions that you have to one one they're hard to spot. Number two, it's they're they're yeah, I mean it's hard to poke holes in those kinds of things when they're written so well by a Supreme Court justice. So it was a good real world example of the level of writing that the Supreme Court uses when putting together their decisions. Um, yeah, and I'm just trying to read through the interpretive essay to see if there's anything here that yeah, okay. Nothing overly crazy. Okay, so here's we talked about democracy. Yeah, that's the only one I think is really abnormal. There's also an aristocracy, which is just ruled by the rich and the property owners. Um, Notably, this is a slave society, so they're very much see some people as not being worthy of the worthy of the right to vote at this stage. But here we go. All right, this much has been agreed, Glaucon. For a city that is going to be governed on a high level, women must be in common. Here we go. A little bit of equality here. Children and their entire education must be in common, and similarly, the practices in war and peace must be in common, and their kings must be among those among them who have proved best in philosophy and with respect to war. Yes, it has been agreed. Furthermore, we also accepted that when the rulers are once established, they must take the lead and settle the soldiers in houses, such as we spoke before, and that nothing private for anyone but are common for all. And in addition to such houses, as to possessions, if you remember, we presumably came to an agreement about what sort they are to have. Yes, I do remember, he said. And we suppose that no one must possess any of the things the others nowadays have, but that like champions of war and guardians, they will receive a wage annually from others, consisting of the bare subsistence required for their guarding, and for this wage they must take care of themselves and for the rest of the city. What you say is right, I said. But come, since we have completed this, let's recall where we took the detour and brought us here so that we can go back the same way. That's not hard, he said. You were presenting your arguments pretty much as you are doing now, and though you had completed your description of what concerns the city, saying that you would class a city such as you then described, and the man like it as good, and you did this, as it seems, in spite of the fact that you had still finer city and men to tell of. Anyhow, you were saying that the other cities are mistaken if this one is right. Concerning the remaining regimes, as I remember, you asserted that there are 4 forms it is worthwhile to have account of, and whose mistakes are worth seeing, and similarly with the men who are like these regimes. Oh yeah, because the people are like the regimes, because the city is a reflection of the human soul, and he goes into that tripart soul. So concerning the remaining regimes, as I remember, you asserted that there are 4 forms it is worthwhile to have an account of, and whose mistakes are worth seeing, and similarly with the men who are like these regimes, so that, when we have seen them all and agreed which man is best and which worst, we could consider whether the best man is happiest and the worst most wretched, or whether it is otherwise. And just as I was asking which 4 regimes you meant, Polemarchus and Adamantius interrupted. That's how you picked up the argument and got here. What you remember, I said, is quite correct. Well then, like a wrestler, give me the same hold again, and when I put the same question, try to tell what you were going to say then. If I am able, I said. And in fact, he said, I myself really desire to hear what 4 regimes you meant. It won't be hard for you to hear them, I said. For those I mean, there are also the ones having names. The one that is praised by the many, that Cretan and Laconian regime. The second in place and second in praise, the one called oligarchy, the regime filled with throngs of evil. And this regime's adversary, arising next in order, democracy. And then the noble tyranny at last, excelling all of these, for the 4th and most extreme illness of a city. Or have you some other idea of a regime that fits into the same distinct form? For dynasties and purchased kingships and certain regimes of the sort are somewhere between these, and one would find them no less among the barbarians than the Greeks. At any rate, he said, many strange ones are talked about. Do you know, I said, that it is necessary that these also be as many forms of human characteristics as there are forms of regimes? Or do you suppose that the regimes arise from an oak or rocks, and not from the dispositions of man in the cities, which, tipping on the scales as it were, draw from the rest along with them? Notably, that sense of like drawing from nature is not only very much rooted in Hitler ideology, which is like he would that group of people would often say from blood and soil, which is to mean that they are the same they share a similar bloodline and are from the same soil, which was like the Rhineland around the river Rhine, I believe. And so like there was, I mean, obviously very racist notions around that. But here in this, we're this is kind of pointing to an later ideas than this book, but earlier ideas than that Second World War ideology of the roots of our philosophical nature being rooted in nature, as in like arising out of like some sort of evolutionary process, like perhaps like a Hobbesian state of nature in that kind of mind, which is where like the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That kind of ideology. So is it? Do you suppose that these regimes rise from oak and rocks, or rocks? Do these ideas stem from things that are natural, or these idealistic notions that we are then going to suppose upon other people? Um, he hasn't really gotten to any answers yet, so we'll keep going. Well, we have already described the man who is like the aristocracy, a man who we rightly assert that he is both good and just. Yes, we have described him. Must we next go through the worst man, the man who loves victory and honor, fixed in relation to the Laconian regime, and then, in turn, an oligarchic and a democratic man, and the tyrannic man, so that seeing the most unjust man, we can see him in opposition to the most just man. If so, we have a complete consideration of how pure justice is related to pure injustice, with respect to the happiness and wretchedness of the man possessing them. In this way, we may be persuaded either by Thrasymachus and pursuing injustice, or by the argument that is now coming to light and pursue justice. That, he said, is most certainly what must be done. Then, just as we began by considering the various dispositions in the regimes before considering them in a private man, supposing that to be the more luminous way, so must we now consider the first regime that loves honor. I can give no other name that is used for it in common parlance. It should be called either timocracy or timarchy, and in relation to this regime we shall consider the like man, and after that oligarchy and the oligarchic man. Later, after having looked at democracy, we'll view a democratic man, and fourth, having gone to the city that is under tyranny and seeing it, we will then look into the tyrannical soul. We shall try to become adequate judges of the subject we propose for ourselves. It would in any case, he said, be a reasonable way for the observation and judgment to take place. Well, come then, I said. Let's try to tell the way in which a democracy would arise from an aristocracy. Or is it simply the case that change in every regime comes from that part of it which holds the ruling offices when faction arises in it? Well, when it is of one mind, it cannot be moved, be it composed of ever so few. Yes, that's so. Then, Glaucon, I said, how will our city be moved, and in what way will the auxiliaries and rulers divide into factions against each other and among themselves? Or do you want us, as does Homer, to pray to the muses to tell us how faction first attacked, and shall we say that they speak to us with high tragic talk, as though they were speaking seriously, playing and jesting with us like children? How? Something like this. A city so composed is hard to be moved, but since for everything that has come into being there is decay, not even a composition such as this will remain for all time. It will be dissolved, and this will be its dissolution, bearing the barrenness of soul and bodies comes not only to plants in the earth, but to animals on the earth, when revolutions complete for each the bearing round of circles. For ones with short lives the journey is short. For those whose lives are the opposite, the journey is opposite. Although they are wise, the men you educate as leaders of the city will nonetheless fail to hit on the prosperous birth and barrenness of your kind with calculation aided by sensation, but it will pass by them, and they will at some point in time beget children when they should not. For a divine birth there is a period of comprehended by a perfect number. For a human birth, by the first number in which root the square increases, comprising 3 distances and 4 limits of elements that make like and unlike, and that wax and wane, render everything conversable and rational. Of these elements, the root 4 3 mated with the 5, thrice increased, produces two harmonies. One of them is equal in unequal number of times, taken 100 times over. The other is of equal length in one way, but is oblong on one side. Of the 100 rational diameters of the 5, lacking one for each, or if of irrational diameters, lacking two of each on the other side, of the 100 cubes of the 3, this whole geometrical number is sovereign of better and worse begettings. And when your guardians from ignorance of them cause grooms to live with brides out of season, the children will have neither good natures nor good luck. Their predecessors will choose the best of these children, but nevertheless, since they are unworthy, when they in turn come to the powers of their fathers, they will as guardians first begin to neglect us by having less consideration than is required, first for music, and second for gymnastic, and from there your young will become more unmusical, and rulers chosen for them won't be guardians very apt at tasting Herod's races, and yours gold and silver and bronze and iron, and the chaotic mixing of iron with silver and of bronze with gold and engenders unlikeness and inharmonious irregularities, which once they arise will always breed war and hatred in the place where they happen to arise. Faction must always be said to be of this ancestry wherever it happens to arise. So he's basically stating that disharmony in births, which is like the different classes of people mixing with one another, and this isn't perhaps a crude argument for the caste system, either in like the different social classes in like say Britain or in like India. He's essentially arguing for that, and it says that that's what the undoing of society is. But perhaps he's reaching on to a different point, that like there is a harmony in society, and when everyone sticks to their social roles, things work out better. But it seems like that's just a way to impose like say like a patriarchal view of society, or just to create power structures that elevates one group of people but holds another group of people down, which is often the way it plays out in society. But nevertheless, here we go. And we'll say, he said, that what the muses answer is right. Necessarily, I said, for they are muses. What, he said, do the muses say next? Once faction has arisen, I said, each of these two races, the iron and bronze, pull the regime towards money-making and the possession of land, houses, gold, and silver, while the other two, the gold and silver, not being poor but rich by nature, led the souls toward virtue and the ancient establishment. Struggling and straining against one another, they came to an agreement on the middle way. They distributed land and houses to be held privately, while those who previously were guarded by them as free friends and supporters then enslaved and held as serfs and domestics, and they occupied themselves with war and in guarding against these men. In my opinion, he said, this is the source of this transformation. Wouldn't this regime, I said, be a certain middle between aristocracy and oligarchy? Most certainly. This will be the way of the transformation. But once transformed, how will it be governed? Or is it evident that in some things it will imitate the preceding regime, in others oligarchy because it is a middle, and that it will also have something peculiar to itself? That's the way it is, he said. In honoring the rulers, and in the abstention of its war-making parts from farming and the manual arts, and the rest of the money-making, in its provision for common meals, and caring for gymnastic, and the exercise of war, in all such ways won't it imitate the preceding regime? Yes. But in being afraid to bring the wise to the ruling offices, because the men of its kind it possesses are no longer simple and earnest, but mixed, and in leaning towards spirited and simpler men naturally more directed to war than to peace, in holding wiles and stratagems of war in honor, and in spreading all its time making war, won't most such aspects be peculiar to this regime? Yes. And such men, I said, will desire money just as those oligarchs do, and under cover of darkness pay fierce honor to gold and silver, because they possess storehouses and domestic treasuries where they can deposit and hide them. And they will have walls around their houses exactly like private nests, where they can make lavish expenditures on women and whatever else they might wish. Very true, he said. And then they will also be stingy with money because they honor it and don't acquire it openly, but pushed on by desire, they will love to spend other people's money, and they will harvest pleasure stealthily, running away from the law like boys from a father. This is because they weren't educated by persuasion, but by force. The result of neglect of the true muse accompanied by arguments and philosophy, while giving more distinguished honor to gymnastic than music. You certainly speak of a regime, he said, which is a mixture of bad and good. Yes, it is mixed, I said, but due to the dominance of spiritedness, one thing alone is most distinctive in it: love of victories and of honors. Very much so, he said. Then, I said, this is the way this regime would come into being and what it would be like, given the fact that we are only outlining a regime's figure in speech and not working out its details precisely, since even the outline is sufficient for seeing the justest man and the unjustest one. And it is impractically long job to go through all the regimes and all dispositions and leaving nothing out. Right, he said. Who, then, is the man corresponding to this regime? How did he come into being, and what sort of man is he? I suppose, said Adeimantus, that as far as the love of victory goes, he'd be somewhere near to Glaucon here. Perhaps in that, I said. But in these other respects his nature does not, in my opinion, correspond to Glaucon's. Which respects? He must be more stubborn, I said, and somewhat less apt at music, although he loves it, and must be a lover of hearing, although he's by no means skilled in rhetoric. With slaves such a man would be brutal, not merely despising slaves as the adequately educated man does, but with free men he would be tame and to rulers most obedient. He is a lover of ruling and of honor, not basing his claim to rule on speaking or anything of the sort, but on warlike deeds and everything connected with war. He is a lover of gymnastic and the hunt. Yes, he said, that is a disposition belonging to this regime. Wouldn't such a man, I said, when he is young, also despise money, but as he grows older, take even more delight in participating in the money-lover's nature, and not be pure in his attachment to virtue, having been abandoned by the best guardian? What's that? Adeimantus said. Argument, mixed with music, I said. It alone, when it is present, dwells within the one possessing it, as a savior of virtue throughout life. What you say is fine, he said. Such, then, I said, is the timocratic youth, like the timocratic city. Most certainly. And this is how it comes into being, I said. Sometimes he is the young son of a good father who lives in a city that is not under a good regime, a father who flees the honor, the ruling offices, the lawsuits, and everything of the sort that's to the busybody's taste, and who is willing to be gotten the better of, so as not to be bothered. In what way, then, does he come into being? He says. When, I said, in the first place, he listens to his mother's complaining. Her husband is not one of the rulers, and as a result she is at a disadvantage among the other women. Moreover, she sees that he isn't very serious about money and doesn't fight and insult people for its sake in private actions in courts and in public, but takes everything of the sort in an easy-going way, and she becomes aware that he always turns his mind to himself and neither honors nor dishonors her very much. He complains about all this and says that his father is lacking in courage and too slack, and, of course, chants all the other refrains such as women are likely to do in cases of this sort. Yes, indeed, said Adeimantus. It's just like them to have many complaints. And you know, I said, that the domestics of such men, those domestics who seem well disposed, sometimes also secretly say similar things to the sons, and if they see someone who owes him money, or does some other injustice, and whom the father doesn't prosecute, they urge the son to punish all such men, when he becomes a man, and thus to be more of a man than his father. And when the son goes out, he hears and sees other similar things, those in the city who mind their own business called simpletons, and held in small account, and those who don't, honored and praised, Now, when the young man hears and sees all this, and, on the other hand, hears his father's arguments and sees his practices at close hand, contrasted with those of the others, he is drawn by both of these influences. His father waters the calculating parts of his soul and causes it to grow. The others, the desiring and spirited parts, because he doesn't have a bad man's nature, but he has kept bad company with others. Drawn by both of these influences, he came to the middle and turned over the rule in himself to the middle part, the part that loves victory and is spirited. He became a haughty-minded man who loves honor. In my opinion, he said, you have given a complete description of this man's genesis. Therefore, I said, we have the second regime and the second man. We have, he said. Then next shall we, with Aeschylus, tell of another man set against another city, or rather, shall we follow our plan and tell the first of the first city? Tell first of the city. Most certainly, he said. And I suppose oligarchy would come after such a regime. What kind of arrangement do you mean by oligarchy? He said. The regime founded on a property assignment, I said, in which the rich rule and the poor man has no part in the ruling office. I understand. Mustn't it first be told how this transformation from timarchy to oligarchy takes place? Yes, and really, I said, the way it is transformed is plain, even to a blind man. How? The treasure house full of gold, I said, which each man has, destroys that regime. First they seek out expenditures for themselves and pervert the laws in that direction. They themselves and their wives disobey them. That's likely, he said. Next, I suppose, one man sees the other and enters into a rivalry with him, and thus they made the multitude like themselves. That's likely. Well then, I said, from there they progress in money-making, and the more honorable they consider it, the less honorable they consider virtue. Or isn't virtue in tension with wealth? And as though they were lying in the scale of balance, always inclining in opposite directions. Quite so, he said. Surely, when wealth and the wealthy are honored in a city, virtue and the good men are less honorable. Plainly. Surely what happens to be honored is practice, and what is without honor is neglected. That's so. Instead of men who love victory and honor, they finally become lovers of money-making and money, and they praise and admire the wealthy man, and bring him to the ruling offices, while they dishonor the poor man. Certainly. Therefore, don't they then set down a law defining an oligarchic regime by fixing an assignment of a sum of money where it's more of an oligarchy, the sum is greater, where less of an oligarchy, less, prescribing that the man whose substance is not up to the level of the fixed assignment shall not participate in the ruling offices. Don't they either put this into effect by force or arms, or before it becomes that they arouse fears and so establish this regime? Or isn't it that way? It is certainly. This is, then, speaking generally, its establishment. Yes, he said. But what is the character of the regime, and what are the first mistakes when they are going, which we were saying it contains? First, I said, the very thing that defines this regime is one. Reflect. If a man were to choose pilots of a ship in that way, on the basis of property assessments, and wouldn't entrust one to a poor man, even if he were a more skilled pilot, they would make a poor sailing, he said. Isn't this also so for any other kind of rule whatsoever? So I suppose, at least. Except for a city, I said. Or does it also apply to a city? Certainly, he said. Most of all, insofar as it is the hardest and greatest kind of rule. Then oligarchy would contain this one mistake that is of such proportions. It looks like it. And what about this? Is this a lesser mistake than the former one? What? Such a city's not being one, but of necessity two. Such a city's not being one, but of necessity two. The city of the poor and the city of the rich dwelling together in the same place, ever plotting against each other. No, by Zeus, he said. That's no less of a mistake. And further, this isn't a fine thing, that their being perhaps unable to fight any wars, first on account of being compelled either to use the multitude armed and be more afraid of it than the enemy, or not to use it, and thus show up as true oligarchs on the field of battle, and besides, on account of their not being willing to contribute money because of it, because they love it. No, it's not a fine thing. And what about this? The tendency to be busybodies we were condemning long ago, the same men in such a regime engaged in farming, money making, and war making at the same time. Does that seem right? In no way whatsoever. Now see whether this regime is the first to admit the greatest of all these evils. What? Allowing one man to sell everything that belongs to him and another to get a hold of it, and when he has sold it, allowing him to live in the city while belonging to none of its parts, called neither a money maker, nor a craftsman, nor a knight, nor a hoplite, but a poor man without means. Yes, he said, it is the first. Then, this sort of thing is at least not prevented in oligarchies. Otherwise, some wouldn't be super rich while others are out and out poor. Right. Reflect on this. When such a man was wealthy and was spending, was he then of any more profit to the city with respect to the functions we were mentioning just now? Or did he seem to belong to the rulers, while in truth he was neither a ruler nor a servant of the city, but a spender of this means? That was the way it was, he said. He seemed, but was nothing other than a spender. Do you wish us, I said, to say of him that, as a drone growing up in a cell is a disease of the hive, such a man growing up in a house is a drone and a disease of the city? Most certainly, Socrates, he said. Hasn't the god made all drones with wings stingless, Adeimantus? But only some drones with feet stingless, while others have terrible stings? From the stingless ones come those who end up as beggars in old age, while from those who have stings come all who are called wrongdoers. Very true, he said. It's plain, therefore, I said, that in a city where you see beggars, somewhere in the neighborhood thieves, cut purses, temple robbers, and craftsmen of all such evils are hidden. It is plain, he said. What then? In cities under oligarchies, don't you see beggars present? Just about everyone except the rulers, he said. Aren't we to suppose, I said, that there are also many wrongdoers with stings among them, whom the ruling offices diligently hold down by force? We must certainly suppose so, he said. Shall we assert that such men arise there as a result of want of education, bad rearing, and of bad arrangement of the regime? We shall assert it. Well, anyhow, such would be the city under an oligarchy, and it wouldn't contain all these evils, and perhaps even more. That's pretty nearly it, he said. Then let's take it, I said, that we have developed the regime called oligarchy, one that gets its ruler on the basis of property assessment, and next let's consider how the man similar to it comes into being and what he's like once he has come into being. Most certainly, he said. Is this the principal way in which the transformation from that timocratic man to an oligarchic one takes place? How? When his son is born, he first emulates his father and follows in his footsteps, and then sees him blunder against the city as is against a reef, and waste his property as well as himself. He had either been a general or held some other great ruling office, and then got entangled with the court, suffering at the hands of the sycophants, and underwent death, exile, or dishonor, and lost his whole substance. That's likely, he said. And the son, my friend, seeing and suffering this, and having lost his substance, is frightened, I suppose, and thrusts love of honor and spiritedness headlong out of the throng of his soul, and, humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to money-making, and bit by bit, saving and working, he collects money. Don't you suppose that such a man now puts the desiring and money-loving part of the throne, and makes it the great king within himself, girding it with tiaras, collars, and Persian swords? I do, he said. And I suppose he makes the calculating and spirited parts sit by it on the ground on either side and be slaves, letting the one neither calculate about nor consider anything but where more money will come from less, and letting the other admire and honor nothing but wealth and the wealthy, while loving the enjoyment of no other honor than that resulting from the possession of money, and anything that happens to contribute to getting to it. There is, he said, no other transformation so quick and so sure from a young man who loves honor to one who loves money. Is this then, I said, the oligarchic man? At least he is transformed out of a man who was like the regime out of which oligarchy came. Then let's consider if he would be like. Yes, let's consider that. In the first place, wouldn't he be similar in giving the highest place to money? Of course. And further, in being stingy and a toiler, satisfying only his necessary desires and not providing for the other expenditures, but enslaving the other desires as vanities. Most certainly. A sort of squalid man, I said, getting a profit out of everything, filling up his storerooms, exactly the kind of man the multitude praises. Isn't this the one who is like such a regime? In my opinion, at least, he said, money in any event is held in honor above all by the city and the man like it. For I don't suppose, I said, such a man has devoted himself to education. Not in my opinion, he said. Otherwise, he wouldn't have set a blind leader over the course and honored it above all. Good, he said. Good, I said. But consider this. Won't we say that due to the lack of education, drone-like desires come to be in him, some of the beggar varieties, others of the wrongdoing variety, held down forcibly by his general diligence? Surely, he said. Do you know, I said, to what you must look if you want to see the wrongdoings of these men? To what, he said. To their guardianship of orphans and any occasion of the kind that comes their way and gives them a considerable license to do injustice. True. Isn't it plain from this that when such a man has a good reputation in other contractual relations, because he seems to be just, he is forcibly holding down bad desires, which are there, but with some decent part of himself. He holds them down not by persuading them that they had better not, nor by taming them with argument, but by necessity and fear, doing so because he trembles for his whole substance. Very much so, he said. And by Zeus, my friend, I said, you'll find the desires that are akin to the drone present in most of them when they have to spend what belongs in others. Indeed, you most certainly will, he said. Such a man, therefore, wouldn't be free from faction within himself, nor would he be simply one, but rather in some sense twofold, although for the most part his better desires would master his worse desires. That's so. Then on this account I suppose such a man would be more graceful than many, but the true virtue of the single-minded and harmonized soul would escape far from him. That's my opinion. Furthermore, the stingy man is a poor contestant when with his private means he competes for some victory or any other noble object of his ambition in the city. He's not willing to spend money for the sake of good reputation or any such contests, afraid to awaken the spendthrift desires, and to summon them to an alliance and a love of victory. He makes war like an oligarch, with a few of his troops, is defeated most of the time, and stays rich. Quite so, he said. Do we then still doubt, I said, that the stingy money-making man, in virtue of his likeness, corresponds to the oligarchic city? Not at all, he said. Then democracy must, as it seems, be considered next. In what way it comes into being, once come into being, what it is like, so that when we know the character of such a man in his turn, we can bring him forward for judgment. In that, he said, we would at least be proceeding just as we were. Doesn't, I said, the transformation from an oligarchy to a democracy take place in something like the following way, as a result of the insatiable character of the good that oligarchy proposes for itself, the necessity of becoming as rich as possible? How, he said. I suppose that because the rulers rule in it thanks to possessing much, they are unwilling to control those among the youth who became licentious by a law forbidding them to spend and waste what belongs to them, in order that by buying and making loans on the property of such men they can become richer and more honored. That they do above all. Isn't it by now plain that it's not possible to honor wealth in a city and at the same time adequately to maintain moderation among the citizens, but one or the other is necessarily neglected? That's fairly plain, he said. Then by their neglect and encouragement of licentiousness in oligarchies, they have sometimes compelled human beings who are not ignoble to become poor. Quite so. Then I suppose these men sit idly in the city, fitting out with stings and fully armed, some owing debts, some dishonored, and some both, hating and plotting against those who have acquired what belongs to them and to all the rest too, gripped by a love of change. That's so. And these money makers, with heads bent down, not seeming to see these men, wounded with injections of silver, any man among the remainders who yields will, and carried off father a, from the father a multitude offspring in interest, they make the drone and the beggar great in the city. Very great indeed, he said. And at all events, I said, they aren't willing to quench this kind of evil, as it is bursting into flame, either by preventing a man from doing what he wants with his property, or, alternatively, by instituting another law that resolves such cases. Which law? The one that takes second place to the former law, and which compels the citizens to care for virtue. For if someone were to prescribe the most voluntary contracts are to be made at the contractor's own risk, the citizens would make money less shamelessly in the city, and fewer evils of the kind we were just describing would grow in it. Far fewer, he said. But as it is, I said, for all these reasons, the rulers in the city treat the ruled in this way, and as for themselves and their own, aren't their young luxurious, and without taste for work of body or of soul, too soft to resist pleasures and plains, and too idle? What else could they be? And haven't they themselves neglected everything except money making, and paid no more attention to virtue than the poor? Yes, they have. When the rulers and the ruled, each prepared in this fashion, come alongside of each other, either wayfaring or in some other community, on trips to religious festivals or in campaigns, become shipmates or fellow soldiers, or even observing one another in dangers themselves, the poor are now in no wise dispensed by the rich. Rather, it is often the case that a lean, tanned poor man is ranged in battle next to a rich man, reared in the shade, surrounded by a great deal of alien fleshes, and sees him panting and in full perplexity. Don't you suppose he believes that it is due to the vice of the poor that such men are rich? And when the poor meet in private, one passes the word to the other, those men are ours, for they are nothing. I certainly know very well, he said, that this is what they do. Just as sickly bodies need only a slight push from the outside to become ill, and sometimes even without an external influence becomes divided by factions within itself, so too doesn't a city that is in the same kind of condition as the body, on a small pretext, men brought as an allies from outside, from a city under an oligarchy by members of one party, from a city under democracy by the members of the other, fall sick and do battle with itself, and sometimes even without any external influence become divided by faction. That is very much the case. Then democracy, I suppose, comes into being when the poor win, killing some of the others and casting out some, and share the regime and the ruling offices with those who are left on an equal basis. And for the most part, the offices in it are given by lot. Yes, he said, this is the establishment of democracy, whether it comes into being by arms or by others, withdrawing due to fear. In what way do these men live, I said, and what is its character of such a regime? For it's plain that the man who is like it will turn out to be democratic. Yes, it is plain, he said. In the first place, then, aren't they free? And isn't a city full of freedom and free speech? And isn't there license in it to do whatever one wants? That is what is said certainly, he said. And where there's license, it's pain, and that each man would organize his life in it privately, just as it pleases him. Yes, it's plain. Then I suppose that in this regime especially, all sorts of human beings come to be. How could they fail to? It is probably the fairest of the regimes, I said, just like a many-colored cloak, decorated in all hues. This regime, decorated with all dispositions, would also look fairest. And perhaps, I said, like boys and women looking at many-colored things, would judge this to be quite fair, to be the fairest regime. Quite so, he said. And, what's more, you blessed man, I said, it's a convenient place to look for a regime. Why is that? Because thanks to its license, it contains all species of regimes, and it is probably necessary for the man who wishes to organize a city, as we were just doing, to go to a city under a democracy. He would choose the sort that pleases him, like a man going into a general store of regimes, and, once having chosen, he would thus establish his regime. Perhaps, he said, he wouldn't be at a loss for patterns at least, and the absence of any compulsion to rule in this city, I said, even if you are competent to rule, or again to be ruled if you don't want to be, or to make war with others, or to make war when the others are making war, or to keep peace when others are keeping it. If you don't desire peace, and if some law prevents you from ruling or being a judge, the absence of any compulsion keeping you from ruling and being a judge anyhow, if you long to do so, isn't such a way of passing the time divinely sweet for the moment? Perhaps, he said, for the moment. And what about this? Isn't the gentleness towards some of the condemned exquisite? Or in such a regime haven't you yet seen men who have been sentenced to death or exile, nonetheless staying and carrying on right in the middle of things, and, as though no one cared or saw, stalking the land like a hero? Yes, many, he said. And this regime's sympathy and total lack of pettiness in despising what we were saying so solemnly when we were founding the city, that unless a man has a transcendent nature, he would never become good. If from earliest childhood his play isn't noble, and all his practices aren't such, how magnificently it tramples all this underfoot, and doesn't care at all from what kinds of practices a man goes to political action, but honors him if only he says he's well disposed towards the magnitude. It's a very noble regime, he said. Then democracy, I said, would have all this and other things akin to it, and would be, as it seems, a sweet regime, without rulers and many-colored dispensing a certain equality to equals and unequals alike. What you say, he says, is quite well known. Reflect then, I said, who is the private man like this? Or just as we did in the other cases of the regimes, must we first consider how he comes to be? Yes, he said. Isn't it this way? I suppose a son would be born to that stingy oligarchic man, a son reared by his father in his dispositions. Of course. Now this son, too, forcibly ruling all the pleasures in himself that are spendthrifty and do not conduce to money making, those ones that are called unnecessary. Plainly, he said. So that we don't discuss in the dark, I said. Do you want us to define the necessary and the unnecessary desires? Yes, that's what I want. Wouldn't those that we were able to wouldn't those we aren't able to turn aside justly be called necessary, as well as all those whose satisfaction benefits us? We are by nature compelled to long for both of these, aren't we? Quite so. Then we shall justly apply the term necessary to them. That is just. And what about this? If we were to affirm that all those are unnecessary of which a man could rid himself if he were to practice a form from youth on, and whose presence, moreover, does no good, and sometimes even does the opposite of good, what would we say be fine? Fine it would be. This is like a word game, trying to keep up with, especially his geometry section, and now this little wordplay here. Okay. Then shall we choose an example of what each of them is, so that we can grasp their general types? Yes, we must. Wouldn't the desire of eating, as long as it is for health and good condition, the desire of mere bread and relish be necessary? I suppose so. The desire for bread, at least, is presumably necessary on both counts, in that it is beneficial, and in that it is capable of putting an end to life. Yes. And so this desire for relish, if in any ways to be beneficial to good condition, most certainly. But what about the desire that goes beyond towards a sorts of food other than this, of which the many can be rid of if it is checked in the youth and educated, and is harmful to the body and to the soul with respect to prudence and moderation? Wouldn't it rightly be called unnecessary? Most rightly indeed. Then wouldn't we also assert that the latter desires are spendthrifty, while the former are money-making, because they are useful for our works? Surely. Then won't we also assert that the same about sex and the other desires? We'll assert the same. And weren't we also saying that the man who we just named as a drone is full of such pleasures and desires and is ruled by the unnecessary ones, while the stingy oligarchic man is ruled by the necessary ones? Of course we were. Well then, going back again, I said, let's say how the democratic man comes out of the oligarchic one. And it looks to me as though it happens in most cases like this. How? When a young man reared as we were just saying, without education and stingly, tastes the drone's honey and has intercourse with fiery, clever beasts who are able to purvey manifold and subtle pleasures with every sort of variety, you presumably suppose that at this point he begins to change from an oligarchic regime within himself to a democratic one. Most necessarily, he said. Then, just as the city was transformed when an alliance from outside brought aid to one party, like to like, is the young man also transformed in the same way when desires of a kindred and like form from without being aid to one party of desires within him? That's entirely certain. And I suppose if a counter-alliance comes to the aid of the oligarchic party in him, either from the advice and scolding of his father, or from other relatives, then faction and counterfaction arise in him and does battle with himself. Surely. And I suppose that at times the democratic party gives way to the oligarchic, and with some of the desires destroyed and others exiled, a certain shame arose in the young man's soul, and order was re-established. Sometimes that does happen, he said. But I suppose that once again other desires, akin to the exiled ones, reared in secret due to the father's lack of knowledge about rearing, came to be many and strong. At least, he said, that's what usually happens. Then drawn to the same associations, their secret intercourse bred a multitude, of course. And finally, I suppose they took the acropolis of the young man's soul, perceiving that it was empty of fair studies and practices and true speeches, and it's these that are the best watchmen and guardians in the thought of men whom the gods love. They are by far the best, he said. Then, in their absence, false and boasting speeches and opinions ran up and seized that place in such a young man. Indeed, they did. They did, he said. Doesn't he go back again to the lotus eaters and openly settle among them? And if some help should come to the stingy element in his soul from relatives, those boasting speeches close the gates of the kingly wall within him, and neither admit the auxiliary force itself, nor do they receive an embassy of speeches of older, private men, but doing battle they hold sway themselves, and naming shame simplicity, they push it out with dishonor, a fugitive, calling moderation cowardliness, and spattering it with mud, they banish it, persuading that measure and orderly expenditure are rustic and illiberal. They join with many useless desires in driving them over the frontier. Indeed they do. Now once they have emptied and purged these from the soul of the man whom they are seizing and initiating in great rites, they proceed to return insolence, anarchy, wastefulness, and shamelessness from exile in a blaze of light, crowned and accompanied by a numerous chorus extolling and flattering them by calling insolence good education, anarchy freedom, wastefulness magnificence, and shamelessness courage. Isn't it in some such way, I said, that a man when he is young changes from his rearing in necessary desires to the liberation and unleashing of unnecessary and useless pleasures? Yes, he said. It's quite magnificently that way. Then I suppose that afterwards such a man lives, spending no more money, effort, and time on the necessary than on the unnecessary pleasures. However, if he has good luck, and his frenzy does not go beyond bounds, and if, also, as a result of getting somewhat older and the great disturbances having passed by, he re-emits a part of the exiles and doesn't give himself wholly over to the invaders, then he lives this life in accordance with a certain equality of pleasures he has established, to whichever one happens along, as though it were chosen by the lot. He hands over the rule within himself until it is satisfied, and then again to another, dishonoring none but fostering them all on the basis of equality. Most certainly. And I said, He doesn't admit true speech or let it pass into the guardhouse. If someone says that there are some pleasures belonging to fine and good desires and some belonging to bad desires, and that the ones must be practiced and honored and the others checked and enslaved, rather he shakes his head at all this and says that all are alike and must be honored on an equal basis. That's exactly, he said, what a man in this condition does. Then, I said, he also lives along day by day, gratifying the desire that occurs to him, at one time drinking and listening to the flute, and another drowning water and reducing, now practicing gymnastic, and again idling and neglecting everything, and sometimes spending his time as though he were occupied with philosophy. Often he engages in politics, and jumping up he says and does whatever chances to come to him. And if he ever admires any soldiers, he turns in that direction, and if it's money makers, in that one. If there is neither order nor necessity in his life, but calling his life sweet, free, and blessed, he follows it throughout. You have, he said, described exactly the life of a man attached to the law equally. The law of equality. Well, I said, I suppose that this man is all various and full of the greatest number of dispositions. The fair and many-colored man, like the city. Many men and women would admire his life because it contains the most patterns of regimes and characters. Yes, that is he said. What then? Shall we set the man of this sort over against democracy as the one who would rightly be called democratic? Let's do so, he said. Then, I said, the fairest regime and the fairest man would be left for us to go through, tyranny and the tyrant. Certainly, he said. Come now, my dear comrade, what is the manner of tyranny's coming into being? For it is pretty plain that it is transformed out of the democracy. Yes, it's plain. Does tyranny come from democracy in about the same manner as democracy from oligarchy? How? The good that they propose for themselves, I said, and for the sake of which the oligarchy was established, was wealth, wasn't it? Yes. And then the greediness for wealth and the neglect for the rest for the sake of money-making destroyed it. True, he said. And does the greediness for what democracy defines as good also dissolve it? What do you say it defines as that good to be? Freedom, I said. For surely in a city under democracy, you would hear that this is the finest thing it has, and that for this reason it is the only regime worth living in for anyone who is by nature free. Yes, indeed, he said. That's an often repeated phrase. Isn't that true in America? For surely in a city under democracy you would hear that this is the finest thing it has, and that for this reason it is the only regime worth living in for anyone who is by nature free. That freedom is that chief quality. Then I said, as I was going to say just now, does the insatiable desire of this and the neglect of the rest change this regime and prepare it for a tyranny? How? He said. I suppose that when a democratic city, once it's thirsted for freedom, gets bad wine-bearers as its leaders and gets more drunk than it should on this unmixed draught, then, unless the rulers are very gentle and provide a great deal of freedom, it punishes them, charges them with being polluted and oligarchs. Yes, he said, that's what they do. And it spatters with mud those who are obedient, alleging that they are willing slaves of the rulers and nothings, I said. Well, it praises and honors, both in private and in public, the rulers who are like the ruled, and the ruled who are like the rulers. Isn't it necessary in such a city that freedom spread to everything? How could it be otherwise? And, my friend, I said, for it to filter down to the private houses and end up by anarchies being planted in the very beasts? How do we mean by that? He said. That a father, I said, habituates himself to be like his child and fear his sons, and a son habituates himself to be like his father and to have no shame before or fear of his parents. That's so he may be free. And metic is on an equal level with townsman and townsman with metic, and similarly with the foreigner. Yes, he said, that's what happens. These and other small things of the following kind come to pass, I said, as the teacher is in such a situation is frightened of the pupils and fawns on them, so the students make light of their teachers, as well as their attendants, and generally the young copy their elders, and compete with them in speeches and deeds, while the old come down to the level of the young, imitating the young. They are overflowing with facility and charm, and that's so that they won't seem to be unpleasant or despotic. Most certainly, he said. And the ultimate in the freedom of the multitude, my friend, I said, occurs in such a city when the purchased slaves, males and female, are no less free than those who have bought them. And we almost forgot to mention the extent of the law of equality, and of freedom in relations of women and with men, and men with women. Won't we, he said, with Aeschylus, say whatever just came to our lips? Certainly, I said. I shall do just that. A man who didn't have the experience couldn't be persuaded to the extent to which beasts subject to human beings are freer here than in another city. The bitches follow the proverb exactly and become like their mistresses. And, of course, there come to be horses and asses who have gotten the habit of making their way quite freely and solemnly, bumping into whomever they happen to meet on the roads, if he doesn't stand aside, and all else be similarly full of freedom. You're telling me my own dream, he said. I myself repeatedly suffer that very same thing when journeying to the country. Then summing up all these things together, I said, do you notice how tender they make their citizen soul, so that if someone proposes anything that smacks them in any way of slavery, they are irritated and can't stand it? And they end up, as you well know, by paying no attention to the laws, written or unwritten, in order that they may avoid having any masters at all. Of course I know it, he said. Well then, my friend, I said, this is the beginning, so fair and heady, from which tyranny, in my opinion, naturally grows. It surely is a heady beginning, he said, but what's next? The same disease, I said, as that which arose in the oligarchy and destroyed it, arises so in this regime, but bigger and stronger, as a result of the license, and enslaves democracy. And really, anything that is done to excess is likely to provoke a correspondingly great change in the opposite direction, in seasons, in plants, in bodies, and in particular, not least in regimes. That's probable, he said. Too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery, both for private men and city. Yes, that's probable. Well then, I said, tyranny is probably established out of no other regime than democracy. I suppose the greatest and most savage slavery out of extreme freedom. Yes, he said, that's reasonable. But I suppose you weren't asking that, I said, but rather what disease, growing naturally in oligarchy and democracy alike, enslaves the latter. What you say is true, he said. Well then, I said, I meant of that class of idle, extravagant men. The most courageous part of them leads, the less courageous part follows. It's just these whom we liken to drones, some equipped with stings, others without stings. That's right, he said. Well then, I said, when these two come into being in any regime, they cause trouble, like phlegm and bile in a body, and it's against them that the good doctor and lawgiver of a city, no less than a wise beekeeper, must take long-range precautions, preferably that they not come into being. But if they do come into being, that they be cut out as quickly as possible, cells and all. Yes, by Zeus, completely. Well then, I said, let's take it like this, so that we may more distinctly see what we want. How? In the argument, let's divide the city under a democracy into three parts, which is the way it actually is divided. One class is surely that which, thanks to the license, grows naturally in it no less than the oligarchic city. That's so. But it's far fiercer here than in the other. How's that? There, due to its not being held in honor, but being driven from the ruling offices, it is without exercise, and isn't vigorous. But in a democracy, presumably, this class, with few exceptions, leads, and its fiercest part does the speaking and the acting, while the rest alight near the platform and buzz, and don't endure the man who says anything else. The result is that everything, apart from a certain few exceptions, is governed by this class in such a regime. Quite so, he said. Well, there is also another class that always distinguishes itself from the multitude. What class? Presumably, when all are engaged in money making, the men most orderly by nature become, for the most part, richest. Likely. Then I suppose that it is there that the most honey and that easiest to get to can be squeezed out by the drones. How, he said, could one squeeze it out of those who have little? Then I suppose such rich men are called the drone's pasture. Just about, he said. And the people who would be the third class, all those who do their own work, don't meddle in affairs, and don't possess very much. Whenever they assemble, they constitute the most numerous and most sovereign class in a democracy. Yes, they do, he said. But they aren't willing to assemble very frequently unless they get some share of the honey. Therefore, they always get a share, I said, to the extent that the leaders, in taking away the substance of those who have it and distributing it among the people, are able to keep the greatest part for themselves. Yes, he said. They don't get a share in that way. Then I suppose that those men whose property is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people and by doing whatever they can. Of course. For this they are charged by the others, even if they don't desire to make innovations, with plotting against the people and being oligarchs. Of course. And therefore, when they see that the people are trying to do them an injustice, not willing but out of ignorance, and because they are deceived by the slanderers, they at last end up whether they want to or not, by becoming true oligarchs. They do not do so willingly, but the drone who stings them engenders this evil too. That's entirely certain. And then come impeachments, judgments, and contests against one another. Quite so. Aren't the people always accustomed to set up some one man as their special leader, and to foster him and to make him grow great? Yes, they are accustomed to doing that. It's plain, therefore, I said, that when a tyrant grows naturally, he spouts from a root of leadership and from nowhere else. That is quite plain. What is the beginning of the transformation from leader to tyrant? Or is it plainly when the leader begins to act out the tale that is told in connection with the temple of the Lycian Zeus in Arcadia? What's that? That the man who tastes of the single morsel of human inwards cut up with those of other sacrificial victims must necessarily become a wolf. Or haven't you heard that speech? I have. Isn't it also the same for the leader of a people who, taking over a particularly obedient mob, does not hold back from shedding the blood of his tribe, but unjustly brings charges against a man, which is exactly what they usually do, and, bringing him before the court, murders him, and, doing away with a man's life, tastes of kindred blood with unholy tongue and mouth, and banishes and kills and hints at cancellations of debts and redistributions of land? Isn't it also necessarily fated, I say, that after such a man either be slain by his enemies or be tyrant and turn from a human being into a wolf? Quite necessarily, he said. Then this, I said, is the man who incites faction against those who have wealth. This he is. If he is exiled and comes back in spite of his enemies, does he come back a complete tyrant? Plainly. But if they are unable to exile him or to kill him by slandering him to the city, they plot to do away with him stealthily by a violent death. At least, he said, that's what usually happens. All those then whose careers have progressed to the stage now hit upon the notorious tyrannical request to ask the people for some bodyguards to save the people's defenders for them. Quite so, he said. Then I suppose the people's grant the request, frightened for him and sure of themselves. Quite so. Consequently, when a man sees this, one who possesses money and is charged not only with having money, but also with hating the people, he, my comrade, then follows the oracle that was given to Croesus, and flees among many pebbled hermits. He doesn't stay, nor is ashamed to be a coward. End quote. For he couldn't be ashamed a second time, he said. And I suppose, I said, if he's caught, he's given death. Necessarily. And surely it's plain that this leader himself doesn't lie, great in his greatness on the ground, but having cast down many others, stands in the chariot of the city, now a perfected tyrant instead of a leader. Of course, he said. Then let us, I said, go through the happiness of the man and the city in which such a mortal comes to be. Most certainly, he said. Let's go through it. In the first of days of his time in office, I said, doesn't he smile and greet whoever he meets, and not only deny he's a tyrant, but promise much in private and public, and grant freedom from debts, and distribute land to the people and those around himself, and pretend to be gracious and gentle to all? Necessarily, he said. But I suppose that when he is reconciled with some of his enemies outside and has destroyed the others, and there is rest from concern with them, as his first step he is always setting some war in motion, so that the people will be in need of a leader. That's likely. And also so that, becoming poor from contributing money, they will be compelled to stick with their daily business and be less inclined to plot against him. Plainly. Then too, I suppose, if he suspects certain men of having free thoughts, and not putting up with his ruling, so that he can have a pretext for destroying them by giving them to the enemy. For all these reasons, isn't it necessary for a tyrant always to be stirring up war? It is necessary. And is, consequently, all this activity a preparation for being more hateful to the citizens? Of course. Also, don't some of those who helped in setting him up are in power, the manliest among them, speak frankly to him and to one another, criticizing what is happening? That's likely. Then the tyrant must gradually do away with all of them, if he's going to rule, until he is left neither friend nor enemy of any worth whatsoever. Plainly, he must therefore look sharply to see who is courageous, who is great-minded, who is prudent, who is rich, and so happy is he that there is a necessity for him, whether he wants it or not, to be an enemy of all of them and plot against them until he purges the city. A fine purgation, he said. Yes, I said, the opposite of the one the doctors give the two bodies. For they take off the worst and leave the best, while he does the opposite. For it seems, he said, to be a necessity for him, if he is to rule. Therefore, I said, if he is bound by a blessed necessity that prescribes that he either dwells with the ordinary many, even though hated by them, or cease to live. That is precisely his situation, he said. To the extent that he is more hateful to the citizens for doing these things, won't he have more need of more and more trustworthy armed guards? Of course. Who are these trustworthy men, and where will he send for them? On their own, many will come flying, he said, if it gives the wages. These are drones by the dog, I said, of whom you are, in my opinion, again speaking, foreign ones of all sorts. Your opinion is true, he said. And who are the trustworthy ones on the spot? Wouldn't he be willing? What? To take away the slaves from the citizens, free them, and include them among the armed guards surrounding himself? Oh, he would be very willing, he said, since these are doubtless the men most trustworthy for him. The tyrant of whom you speak, I said, is a blessed thing, if he uses such men as friends and trustworthy helpers after he has destroyed the former ones. But he certainly does use such men, he said. And these companions admire him, I said, and the new citizens have intercourse with him, while the decent men hate him and flee from him. What else would they do? It's not for nothing, I said. That tragedy in general has the reputation of being wise, and within it, Euripides of being particularly so. Why is that? Because, among other things, he uttered this phrase, the product of shrewd thought, tyrants are wise from intercourse with the wise. And he plainly meant that these men we just spoke of are the wise with whom a tyrant has intercourse. And he has other great poets, he said, extol tyranny as a condition equal to that of a god, and add much else too. Therefore, I said, because the tragic poets are wise, they pardon us, and all those who have regimes resembling ours, for not admitting them into the regime on the ground that they make hymns to tyranny. I suppose, he said, they pardon us, at least all the subtle ones among them. And I suppose that going around to the other cities, gathering crowds, and hiring fine, big, persuasive voices, they draw the regimes toward tyrannies and democracies. Quite so. And besides this, they get wages that are honored too, most of all by tyrants, as is to be expected, and in the second place by democracy. But the higher they go on the slope in the regimes, the more their honor fails, as though it were unable to proceed for want of breath. Most certainly. But here we've digressed, I said. Let's return to the tyrant's camp. That's fair, numerous, many-colored thing that is never the same, and tell from where its support will come. It's plain, he said, that if there is sacred money in the city, he'll spend it as long as it lasts, along with the property of the men he destroyed, so that people won't be compelled to bring in such large contributions. And what happens when that source gives out? It's plain, he said, that he and his drinking fellows and comrades, male and female, will get their support from their father's property. I understand, I said. The people that beget the tyrant will support him and his comrades. A great necessity will compel it, he said. But what do you have to say to this? I said. What if the people are disconnected, and say that it is not just for a son in his prime to be supported by his father, but the reverse, the father should be supported by the son, and that they didn't beget and set him up so that when he has grown great, they should be slaves to their own slaves, and support him and the slaves along with the flotsam, but so that with him as leader they would be freed from the rich and those who are said to be gentlemen in the city. They now bid him and his comrades to go away from the city, like a father driving a son along with his troublesome drinking fellows out of the house. By Zeus, how this kind of people will then know, he said, the kind of a beast they have begotten, welcomed, and made great, and that they are the weaker driving out the stronger. What are you saying? I said. Will the tyrant dare to use force on his father, and if he doesn't obey, strike him? Yes, he said, once he's taken away his father's arms. You speak of the tyrant as a parricide, and a harsh nurse of an old age, I said, and, as it seems, this would be self-admitted tyranny, and, as the saying goes, the people, in fleeing the smoke of enslavement to free men, will have fallen into the fire of being under the mastery of slaves, and in place of that great and unseasonable freedom, they have put on the dress of the harshest and bitterest enslavement to slaves. That's exactly what happens, he said. Well then, I said, wouldn't we be speaking appropriately if we asserted that we have given an adequate presentation of how a tyranny is transformed out of a democracy, and what it is like when it has become into being? Most certainly, it was adequate. We just finished book 8 out of 10. So we have book 9, 10, and then the interpretive essays still left in this book. But I think it's important to note that, we're talking about political psychology here to a large extent and how one regime arises out of another. But at any point in time, when one regime, whether it's from democratic or not, leans too heavily on one quality, say like freedom or equality in general or justice, it seems that Plato is insisting that its opposite will then come into being, because wholly relying on one virtue is not good enough. We have to seek out fitting childhoods for the positions that we're looking to hold, and we must train ourselves accordingly. I think if we were to modernize this a bit, we could use something like, say, Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, that if we were going to pursue some sort of higher office or pursue some sort of trade, we should take it upon ourselves to be invested and receive training similar to that 10,000 hours in that subject or in that craft, so that we can then build ourselves up to actually handle the work properly. The idea that you need to be born into the right class to be able to run a certain segment of society, I think we have definitively cast out as a bad idea in modern times. But at the same time, we also need to be wary of the missteps that can happen when we are leading a society, and that we can go. I mean, we as human beings are notorious for going too far in one direction and then turning around and going too far in the exact opposite direction. That is notoriously a human failing that we so often do. And so, yeah, and I think if you're going to apply that to the modern times and, like, say, the political election coming up in Canada, as that's where we are, um, I think there's this, like, I mean, of course, I'm going to land on the liberal perspective, so that's naturally where I fall. And I'm not a huge fan of, like, free market capitalism in general, just because there's that whole Adam Smith, the perspective of, like, oh, the silent hand of the market moves and therefore corrects all action in time, certainly leaves a lot of people open for exploitation and for a lot of harms of the market, because one, the market is erratic and shines unequally upon different aspects of society at different points of time. And when you are left out in the cold and are not, and this the silent hand of the market is not in your favor, uh, it it can be brutally savage against those who are poor. And that's the part that we, I mean, socialists in general would then advocate for the need of a social safety net. And especially when there's decent amount of ways to produce money locally, like within a nation, that you we don't really need to um, be worried about going into bankruptcy over. So, like, Canada is rich in a lot of ways. We have a lot of space, we have a lot of natural resources, we have a lot of land, and we can do a lot of things with that to be a rich nation. And so I think, like, the biggest perspective on Pierre Poilievre's side and the conservatives in general is that we need to deregulate and we need to incentivize businesses, and that would then um, not only bring private equity to Canada to take advantage of these big businesses, but that would then trickle down to people by allowing them to have good jobs and to provide them opportunity to work. That just sees a lot of our natural resources be exploited for foreign companies to take advantage of. I see, like, what's happening currently in Canada. I mean, it seems like David Eby approved 20 mega projects that are essentially owned by private capital. Um, but Trudeau with the light rail, that was a project done with nine or so public corporations, most of them on the TSX. Like, Air Canada was given opportunity to buy in to the light rail project, which was clever because it's going to take business away from their Toronto to Montreal routes, which is a huge part of their business. So they avoided the lawsuit by allowing them to buy into the project, I presume. Um, but bringing Canadian corporations to buy into these Canadian projects is a great way to keep the money at home, and especially if they're listed on the TSX. It's otherwise you're just exporting money to the United States for really no reason. And so doing these things with some level of intelligence and actually not taking a shot at David Eby because he's doing the best in these weird situations in BC, to the best of his ability. He is also very much a technocrat in a lot of ways, because I mean, he was head of the law. What was he? He was a lawyer first, and I mean, him and John Horgan are both, like, John Horgan was a career bureaucrat before then switching to politics, where David Eby was a lawyer and was head of his law society when he was in school. I'm not sure about his origins completely, but he was Minister of Justice before becoming premier. But again, very much rooted in that policy and technical expertise of how things operate before then transitioning over to politics and to running the society, which is really what this book is advocating for. There's been notably many different ideas about what a modern philosopher king can look like. And a lot of people have advocated for a lawyer philosopher king in modern times because the law is the basis of politics in general. Other people have advocated for, yeah, anyways, different versions of a philosopher king. So lawyer philosopher king. I can't remember. Was there a doctor philosopher king or a um, anyways, you get the idea. Like there's different ways you can envision such a uh, idea coming to pass. Um, I mean, there's also been Ignatieff, who was actually a philosopher, a political philosopher, becoming a philosopher king, which would be the most direct representation of what, and the highest pinnacle of what this kind of idea represents. But he wasn't even elected, so it's hard to see how what it could actually look like if we truly valued the inputs of a philosopher in the politics and trying to balance these things accordingly. But I think one of the things that philosophers can do best is point out arguments and point out different failings in certain systems. So that's perhaps you getting a snack, buddy boy?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
No, not sugar. It's still in the morning time, bud. You can have some granola bar if you want, or there's oranges in the bottom of the fridge too. But I think in comparing the conservative perspective of just opening up for free market capitalism, Mark Carney offers a much more technocratic perspective and a much more, I think, much more in line with the Canadian way forward. I mean, the Liberal Party, they like to call themselves the natural governing party of Canada, in that because they dominated politics in the 20th century, and we've only seen really a strong resurgence in the Conservative Party with Stephen Harper, because before that it was Brian Mulroney in the late 80s, early 90s. Before that, you don't really see I mean, sorry, backing up for a sec, like they often define prime ministers as dynasties or interludes, because as a dynasty would be winning 3 elections back to back, whether majority or minority, or having 2 strong majority mandates. So the last, I mean, you can kind of people make arguments both ways whether Mulroney was a dynasty or an interlude, because it was only 5 years, but he did win successive back-to-back minority governments. But he did pass free trade agreements, and that was a strong part of the Canadian consciousness at the time, and he was considered a strong personality for some of his achievements. But before him, it was like you had Diefenbaker, who was kind of this strange conservative leader. Certainly, you had leaders like Robert Borden, who were very strong and conservative figures who really. Borden made an impact really in World War One and was really seen kindly for that, I believe. I haven't looked into him in a long time, but yeah, you don't really see a strong conservative force in the last 100 years other than like Stephen Harper. Nice, bud. Good. But the Mark Carney approach seems, one, driven by a technocratic perspective. He wants to reform banking systems. He does seem like a true like neoliberal capitalist, in the sense that like he wants to have more. I mean, he wants to do things intelligently, like bringing in those private market players from Canada to bolster the Canadian economy and to bolster the Canadian loonie, and to give the government a strong position to be able to continue funding these projects more, because the higher the GDP goes, the more their spending power can increase, because they have more tax dollars coming in. But and of course it kind of trickles down a bit, like that's kind of implied by that perspective as well. But he seems also to be a strong proponent of UBI, and the Parliamentary Budget Office just completed another report in February 21st, 2025, February 22nd, somewhere around there. They updated, so initially the UBI report from a few years ago, like 2021, stated that it would be like $106 billion in 2025 dollars. Um, that $106 billion, $107 billion on how much it would cost to implement UBI. But the new report that they just released noted that it would only cost about $56 billion, so long as you refine the definition of what a family is. So they went with the original definition was 106 billion, but an economic family unit, which is anyone who is related by blood or marriage and lives in the same house, would be considered an economic family. And as long as that economic family doesn't make less than $18,000 a year, if that economic family makes less than like $18,000 a year, then you would then get UBI benefits. But if like anyone in that household makes more than that, then you would no longer be subject to getting UBI. And so it took it. So by being able to change that, it's likely in a lot of cases that there's someone in that household who is making some amount of money that amounts to more than like that 20 grand per year. But if there's not, then it's like that um, the benefits get less as you make more money, over 15,000. And so it still incentivizes people to make money because they'll gain more money with UBI, but it'll just be less and less as it goes up. But the one part I think, and the biggest critique of this report, is that it does note that there is a drop off in payroll and that there is a drop off in the number of hours people work. And so those payrolls being paid out to per person does decrease with the addition of benefits. But like, let's be honest, like, who are the ones who are going to be decreasing the number of hours they work? Oh, probably the people who have been working and like need to spend more time at home to get their house in order, or have been working so hard that they can't even keep their head above water, and this provides them that sort of lifeline. The Ontario UBI study, which a lot of this is based off of, was gave a lot of homeless people and a lot of those who needed the money an opportunity to better themselves and to get out of this like financial sinkhole that is poverty, because things get more expensive as you are more poor, like just transportation costs and like everything becomes more expensive. It seems like the poverty trap is real and continues to put people in a cycle of poverty that is very difficult to get out of. Poverty is a socioeconomic condition that is very hard to escape from. And yeah, I think you see some weird things happen, like, oh, people then work less hours. And so like, and notably, this UBI report notes only a small decrease or a moderate decrease. Like I think it's around like 4 or 5% decrease in payroll hours and decrease in, it might even be 3 or 4%, which is fairly, it's not nothing, but it is moderate. And so that cost is estimated to be, I think, something like relatively small, like $4 to $10 billion. But it's not nearly as much as what some conservative critics would think it would be. I think a lot of people are skeptical that it would remain such a small number of people. If you implemented UBI, that only such a small number of people would then choose not to work. I think their criticism is that if you put this in place, that a much higher percentage of people would choose not to work. But we haven't seen that actually played out in any of the data and any of the proofs or any of the studies that have happened beforehand. So there's really no way to know, because there is a psychology difference here, because the Ontario studies were known to only be 2 years in length. If you implemented such a broadband national platform for UBI across the whole country, would it then change the psychology of how people react to the program? I think that's really what's going on here and why people are skeptical of those numbers. But there is no proof to substantiate those concerns until you actually run a full program and it becomes a guarantee that this is going to continue after the 2 year time. I mean, you can't ever give a full guarantee that social safety programs will continue on in perpetuity forever, because they're of course expensive and they take up percentage points of our of our GDP, and so you can never fully guarantee it. But as much as it can be guaranteed, like, um, would that be substantial enough for then people to withdraw from the economic playing field? There certainly aren't really many jobs for people, anyways, and other countries have been begging for our energy. And so, if you combine a UBI approach with the addition of all these energy jobs, you might have to tweak things in order to encourage people to actually go out there and to get those jobs and to work them and to ensure that we have the financial um, uh, we have the enough economic activity happening to be able to sustain a UBI program. But it's clear that, like, I mean, UBI is only going to take people, economic families, up to the point of being able to live. It's not certainly anything luxurious to live off of. It's what, only providing up to $15,000 to $20,000. That's it. That's not really enough to live off of. That's not even 2 grand a month. So how are you going to pay rent? How are you going to pay your mortgage and all your associating fees for an economic family? That's not even just for a single person. Um, it notably it was increased if you have someone with disability, and you increase your benefit if it's with more dependents, like, um, a married couple with children versus without. So, like, there is some flexibility, and you do get more money, but at the end of the day, it's still a very limited amount of money to be able to survive on. And I guess the only places where you'd really be able to see that work is where cost of living is cheap. Like here in Gold River, it would be more than enough money to live off of. I mean, we're practically living off of nothing, and I mean, as long as you have your finances in order and don't have debt, then it's actually quite easy and reasonable to do. It certainly would be easy for seniors, a lot easier for seniors who have had the opportunity to pay off all that debt easily over their lifetime. But yeah, you're still going to see people being driven to work. That's undeniable, because it's not going to be enough to have a lavish lifestyle by any means. But with more and more millennials and Gen Z choosing to have take a retirement, or choosing to, I mean, I think there's a huge trend with millennials taking a mid-career retirement for a few years, whether that's due to not being able to find a job, or just being a little burnt out, and or not really liking the atmosphere that their supervisors create. I think there's a whole mix of reasons being kind of stuffed into it, but for whatever reason, if people are choosing to work less, then I mean, either the free market needs to adjust accordingly to make workplaces more desirable, or I mean, economic times need to be harder so that they're more incentivized to go back to work. And those are the only ways that the free market could solve that issue. But if you have a UBI approach, I mean, yeah, I guess that would be the liberal response. I'm not really a fan of his of Mark Carney's um, blatant turn towards capitalistic means, but I mean, that is the society we live in. And if you're going to do it, you might as well do it with the person who's the best at it, the banker who can lead through a recession. So I don't know. It's certainly up to the democracy. That's the will of the people in general, and I think that's also an important note for Plato in general, is that while he's proposing these different systems of ideas, we of a people have chosen democracy to be the leading course of action and how we make political decisions. And so, or at least the proportional representation system. And so, while he's talking about the philosopher king being the highest ideal in the land, it's also noteworthy to like, as we develop the political ideas throughout history, we notably come to the idea that, like, hey, there's actually a lot of flaws in this sort of system, and as we reform these ideas over time, uh, this approach is perhaps a really useful tool for how we can make political decisions in our modern times, and how we can see what a utopic vision looks like in the future. So that's pretty much all I have to say for today. I'm gonna be reading book 9 and hopefully book 10 over the weekend, and then hopefully we can finally finish off this book. It's been too long already. So there you go. Have a great day.